The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, AFTA members, and thank you very much for your patience. We had slight technical issue, but we are now online and fully functioning. My name is Joanne, and I'm Head of Marketing and Communications at AFTA. Thank you very much for joining us on this Rent Relief Package webinar. And to bring us the content, I have on the line Courtney Duddleston, who is Head of Strategy and Finance. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Joe.
Also on the line, I've got Jason Westbury, AFTA Chief Executive, who of course will chime in and assist with any of the content that we need to cover. Before I hand over,
just not the technical problems, Joe. I'm no help with the technical problems. Apologies, I've had lots of text messages. It's good to know that so many of you are tuned in and listening, and we do appreciate it. We are going to start again. And for all of those that have texted, I really appreciate it, and good to see Joe's managed to fix it. So off we go. Thanks.
Well, we have 222 members today, and we had over 300 registered, so a really fantastic and great engaged audience. For those that haven't been able to make the webinar today, or for others that you think may find this webinar useful, the recording will be available on the AFTA website by 5 o'clock this afternoon. You are all in listen-only mode, but we will be taking questions that are related to the webinar and are general in nature. So without further ado, Courtney, I'm going to hand over to you because I know you put a lot of fantastic effort into preparing this webinar for members.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thanks everyone for your patience and good afternoon. We really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us on this webinar. Where we're going to focus on the announcement made last week by the government around rent relief for small and medium businesses. Okay, so first off, I'm going to try and help set the scene and provide some background information on the announcement that was made last week. And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the new code of conduct and the key principles around this code. And to try and put it all into context for you, we've included some examples of how it would work practically in your business. And we should have some time at the end for any general questions that you might have. So we know that businesses are still having to pay their landlords, even if their workplace has shut down, which in the case of the travel industry is certainly the case. Businesses are essentially facing the perfect storm, really, with a drop-off in revenue coupled with continuing fixed costs, one of them obviously being rental obligations. And so while commercial tenancies are regulated at the state level, by releasing this new code of conduct, the government has essentially set a standard for sensible and pragmatic solutions for landlords and tenants to work together. So last week, the National Cabinet announced a mandatory code of conduct, or the Commercial Tenancies Code. The code is intended to mandate a set of good faith principles to be applied to commercial, retail and industrial leases. Eligibility for the code is based on a business's eligibility for the JobKeeper payment. That being, they are an SME with an annual turnover of up to $50 million and have experienced a downturn in their business. The objective of the code is for a landlord and tenant to share in a proportionate, measured manner, the financial risk and cash flow impact during the COVID-19 crisis. It's about seeking to balance the interests of both the landlord and tenant. It's expected that a landlord and each eligible tenant will negotiate a tailored, bespoke and appropriate temporary arrangement on a case-by-case basis. And it's important to highlight that while this code has been announced, if you have already negotiated with your landlord a lease restructure that you are happy with, then that is completely fine and well done you. The introduction of this code is about ensuring both a landlord and a tenant essentially come to the party and work together to ensure both carry some of the burden. So what are the actual provisions under the mandatory code of conduct? Let's run through some of the principles. Where it can, rent should continue to be paid, and where there is financial distress as a result of COVID-19, then tenants and landlords should negotiate a mutually agreed outcome. There will be a proportionality to rent reductions based on the decline in turnover to ensure that the burden is shared between both landlord and tenant. Landlords will not be able to terminate leases for non-payment of rent. There will be a freeze on all rent increases. There will be a prohibition on penalties for tenants who stop trading or reduce their opening hours. There will be a ban on landlords passing land tax to tenants and a ban on landlords charging interest on unpaid rent. And there will be a prohibition on landlords making a claim to a bank guarantee or security deposit for non-payment of rent. And additionally, any legislative barriers or administrative hurdles to lease extensions will be removed so that a tenant and landlord could agree a rent waiver in return for a lease extension. So we've tried to really break this down for you. Will your landlord reduce your rent bill? Well, the mandatory code of conduct that was signed off by National Cabinet includes a provision that will force commercial landlords to accept rent reductions in proportion to a tenant's decline in turnover due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This will be achieved through a combination of rent waivers and deferrals. Tenants are being encouraged to share their turnover information with their landlord to enable negotiations about how big rent reductions should be, although the government has been clear that this measure does not remove a tenant's obligation to honour the terms of their lease. Landlords are required to offer tenants at least 50% of their rent relief as waivers over the course of the pandemic period and the remainder in deferrals. Deferrals are required to be covered over the balance of a tenant's individual lease term. So meaning, for example, tenants with 3 years left on their lease will be able to gradually pay deferred rent over the course of their agreement. Those with less time on their lease, say for example 6 months remaining, will have 2 years after the pandemic period is over to pay their deferred rent. So the bottom line is landlords cannot refuse requests for rent relief to SME tenants that are eligible for the JobKeeper scheme. Waivers and deferrals will be negotiated individually, but must essentially follow the terms of the mandatory code. So how do you know if your business is eligible to negotiate under the new code? Well, only small and medium businesses with $50 million in annual turnover or less, which are eligible for the JobKeeper wage subsidy scheme, can negotiate under the protections of this new code. And we know that the eligibility criteria for the JobKeeper scheme involves showing that your turnover has declined, comparable to a period a year ago. And I've got no doubt that everyone on this webinar today is eligible for the JobKeeper, and I do hope has already registered for the scheme. So the bottom line, only businesses eligible for JobKeeper payments can negotiate under this code. And we also do expect that within the next 2 to 3 weeks, the tax office will start to begin confirming eligibility to businesses for JobKeeper. So even after the COVID-19 pandemic, can a landlord still evict a tenant? Well, National Cabinet agreed to a nationwide moratorium on evictions late last month, which means small and medium business tenants cannot be evicted from their premises for a period of 6 months. The mandatory code introduced last week also includes a provision that will prohibit landlords from terminating leases or padlocking stores for the non-payment of rent. We know that the Morrison government has been very clear that it expects tenants to honour the terms of their lease and pay rent where possible. But the intention of the code is to prevent landlords from evicting tenants for non-payment of rent during the pandemic period after the moratorium expires in 6 months. So the bottom line with this is that your landlord cannot evict you for non-payment of rent during the pandemic period and must comply with the eviction moratorium slated to last 6 months. Tenants are also protected from any rent increases during the pandemic, with the mandatory code including a specific provision that freezes rent increases. Commercial landlords are prohibited from charging penalties to tenants who stop trading or reduce their opening hours over the course of the pandemic, and they are also banned from passing on land tax to tenants and from charging interest on any unpaid rent. After the pandemic period ends, and there is no concrete date for when that will be yet, landlords are free to resume rent increases along with the terms outlined in individual lease agreements. And so, the bottom line, rent increases have been frozen throughout the pandemic period and all additional penalties are gone too. So who exactly is enforcing this, and what happens if your landlord does not cooperate? Well, state and territory governments are ultimately responsible for commercial tenancy arrangements, which is why each jurisdiction must pass their own law, giving effect to the mandatory code of conduct. Enforcement will be left up to the state and will be overseen through a binding mediation process. And there are a few details as yet about what mediation will look like in each state and territory. But once that information is out, we will make sure that this is available to our members. And so ultimately, this is about both parties coming to the table and negotiating together. Binding mediation will enforce breaches of the code, but it will look different depending on where your business is based. So let's try and bring this to life with a couple of examples reflecting the application of the principle of proportionality and how it would practically work for your business. It's important to note though that this scenario is just an example and the circumstance of each landlord, tenant and lease are different and are subject to negotiation and agreement in good faith. So let's say Mary owns a retail travel agency and has a commercial lease with a suburban shopping centre. Last year, Mary transacted $2 million through her business, making a gross profit of $200,000. She's currently paying $45,000 per annum in rent. Mary has established that due to COVID-19, she will have to temporarily shut her doors and will experience a 100% loss in turnover in her business. So Mary is eligible to be provided with cash flow release in proportion to her loss of turnover experienced. That being, a 100% loss in turnover would result in a guaranteed 100% cash flow release. Under the code, Mary is eligible to receive half as rent-free or a rent waiver, that being half of her annual rent expense, so $22,500, and the second half as a rent deferral, so the remaining $22,500. This deferral of rent is to be recouped over at least 24 months in a manner that's negotiated by both parties, and both parties will need to ensure that any repayment of the deferred rent does not compromise the ability of Mary to recover from the crisis. So we have included another example here, and bear with me, I realise that it's quite a lot to digest. Let's say Justin owns a travel agency and has a commercial lease agreement for his office space in the Sydney CBD. Last year, his business transacted $38 million in sales, of which $8 million was his gross income. He currently has 3 years remaining on his lease agreement, and he is paying $170,000 per annum in rent expense. Justin has established that due to COVID-19, his business will experience a 60% decline in revenue, guaranteeing him 60% cash flow relief to his business. So 60% of his rent expense is $102,000. Justin's cash flow relief would be provided as half as rent-free, being $51,000, and the second half as a rent deferral, being the remaining $51,000. Again, this deferred rent is to be recouped over at least 2 years in a manner negotiated by both the landlord and the tenant, and one that does not compromise the ability of Justin's business to recover from the crisis. So I do hope that what we've run through today has helped to clarify some of your questions around this topic. And as more information around rent relief does surface, I do expect that we may be covering off more webinars on this. And no doubt we've got some questions, so happy to answer those that are of a general nature. So Jo, I'll hand it back to you and we can keep going.
Thanks, Courtney. Let me just have a look at a couple of the questions that we've had come in. So a couple of questions around proving a decrease in turnover, Courtney. Do you have any insight into how the government, how the parties will demonstrate this?
Oh, look, we haven't seen anything in the code at this stage, and Jason, feel free to jump in, but I mean, I can give you a bit of an example of what we have had to do at AFTA. So our landlord is Mirvac. We have requested a lease restructure and some rent-free period with them due to COVID-19. Now, since this mandatory code was announced, they have sent through a document to us for us to fill in. They've specifically requested for us to outline the effect that COVID-19 has had on our business, along with providing past financial statements and our future projections, both before COVID-19 and now that COVID-19 is here. So I expect each landlord will be different in what sort of information that they request. But it's about having that transparency and being open to providing your turnover with your landlord.
Great, thanks, Courtney. I'm just looking at a couple of other questions.
Just while you're looking at that, Jo, if I can, I might just jump in and say that in terms of documentation and leading into when more specifics are presented to us from the various government agencies, I wouldn't be waiting for that. I think it's fairly reasonable that if you've submitted documentation to ATAS and you've got your P&L and your balance sheet for your various annual reviews, and that you would be needing some assistance from us to qualify or validate, I believe that's something that we would be able to provide you as a supporting document, be it that you may have your interim accounts even up until the end of December. So either your accountant could write you a letter that validates that they are bona fide, or you could look to seek some support from us by providing you with a letter of support indicating that what you're submitting has been bona fide and validated by us. So don't hesitate to reach out. I know Naomi's not on the call and she'll probably be cringing, thinking, goodness me, more work for us. But I can imagine that some landlords, will be questioning the validity of some of the information you've been providing. But realistically, all of you, having been through the accreditation phase, will have the various commercial and P&L documentation that you would need. Clearly, some of the challenges are whether you want to show that level of detail to your landlord. So it may be that you look to do an extract and that you get that extract validated by your accountant, who would simply write a letter that says this is a true and correct record of XYZ agency's details that indicate that their revenue for last year was X and their revenue for this year was Y. So I do think you need to be a little sort of avant-garde in your thinking about what documentation you present to these landlords. And even when one day in the future governments do prescribe, I don't know whether we'll see that level of granularity. When you're dealing with self-managed super funds or owners who might be private individuals and they're not large companies, clearly their ability to consume information from you and feel confident that what you're presenting is true and correct may be more difficult for them than perhaps the larger vendors like Mirvac and Westfield and the like, who probably will, like we've experienced, come up with their own set of questionnaires. But I think if along the way you get stuck, or you need a hand, or you want us to help, by all means, that's a good reason to reach out, and we can try and help you through that process of validating that the question that you would need to put forward.
Thanks, Jason. And on that, if you happen to have multiple stores and different landlords, can the managing agent ask for the financials of the whole group, or is it just for that one particular store? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, my Court, I don't know whether you've seen specifics, and I would have suggested the answer is probably no. There won't be specifics about that. I think the thinking here, though, is to be genuine in your transparency. I think that the general theme around which all of these things are working, whether it's rent relief, JobKeeper, or anything else the government's involved in, they are saying to be transparent. Now, if you do have a cluster of stores where you've got one perhaps doing well, and good on you if that's the case. I'd love to know who that question was, don't disclose. But let's just say hypothetically you've got one doing really well and four doing really badly, and that you've got a clustered ownership. I think you would still be able to demonstrate an overall negative outcome. Now, as to what you then present to each of those would, again, be up to you. And I think it really is about making decisions that are defendable and that are as transparent as they can be. I would have thought that depending on who those owners are, the more transparent you are with them, the better. But if they're genuinely unrelated, for example, let's say those stores are in different states. You've got four shops, but they're in different states. I don't think that you would need to cluster, because the codes are going to be applied by each state government. But I would think that if you've got a central owner of multiple stores, like in most things, all roads lead to the ultimate owning entity, and you would need to think about it in a transparent way.
Great. And in terms of demonstrating a decline, Jason, people are just wanting clarification around, does that mean, profit margin, or is that total sales?
It's certainly the way JobKeeper and Court, you may have a different lens to this, but my view is they seem to be focused only on turnover, because the key thing here is how much money is going through the till, so to speak. I don't think anyone's questioning anyone's profitability. Of course, that's a little counterproductive to someone that runs a business, because you can have all the money in the world going through the till, but making no money at the other end.
True.
So therefore, there's a question of capacity to pay. However, from what I can see, most of the tests that are being applied relate to turnover. Court?
No, it's exactly right. That's what they've applied. It's a JobKeeper for now, this rent relief. It's all based on the turnover of the business.
And then looking at a scenario where, say, June to March, you actually had business growth or good sales because the impact of COVID didn't really happen till March onwards. So that's the point that most people are experiencing a hit to their turnover. Do you have an indication of how they should then report on that? Or would it be at the end of the next quarter?
Well, again, I would think take a month-to-month comparison. So if last March you did X and this March you did Y, and that satisfies the 100%, 99% or 92%, then submit that first and see what they ask from there. I think it really is, again, being transparent and real. And clearly it is difficult, because as you're asking for rent relief, realistically we are heading into sort of the heavy hump lifting part of this process now, because as many know that, we've sort of slowly crept up to the no revenue. And even if you are getting a bit of revenue through cancellation fees or the like, which I'm sure many of you aren't seeing any revenue, year-to-year comparison is probably the best way to approach it. So take your March, April figures, or your 2019 figures, and compare them to your 2020 figures. and see how that looks. And Cord, I don't know if you've got some thoughts around that question.
Yeah, no, month to month, I think is right. I mean, we've also been asked to provide some projected numbers too. So some projected numbers that were part of it, that formed our budget for the new financial year, and our new projections now that we're in the world of COVID-19. So I think it will come down to what sort of numbers and what sort of information your landlord asks for as well. Some may not be as specific. And some may want projections and past numbers and everything else that they can think of. So I think it will just come down to each individual situation.
Great, and I think that
will. Go on, sorry, Joe, go.
No, go. You continue.
Well, what I was going to say was, look, I think that clearly the thing for the various landlords is that they've also then got to have a capacity to digest that information and come up with some counter-levering argument. And, the bigger corporations are clearly going to still have a team and staff and people in finance and all the rest of it that want to run spreadsheets and do calculations and what have you. But smaller landlords, certainly those people that might not be in city locations who are dealing with self-managed super funds or husband and wives or the like, this is really a matter of being, serious about how bad things are. And there are plenty of media posts out now talking about how desperate and bad things are in the travel industry. And I would have thought that any landlord that's sitting there that thinking that anyone on this call is doing well is clearly living in another world. So I do think there's if you get pushed back on the basis of what you've presented, then I think you do need to turn to the sort of broader reports that are out there. And again, as I say, if you then need our help, I mean, there's no harm done in us writing letters and supporting you through documentation that says that we confirm that the industry is in XYZ or whatever we might need to do. That service is certainly available to you if you get stuck to try and help you through to get an outcome as quickly as you can, because clearly all of you are going to need these things to happen quick, because every day, when I was on calls this morning with members who it's the middle of the month and they're panicked that they haven't actually paid this month's rent. They know they're 14 days in arrears and they're sort of not too sure what they should do next. And so I do know that we've got very much gotten to the acute phase of this, and it's on everybody's minds. So the sooner you can try and get some agreement, it's one thing you can tick off your to-do list and move on to the next challenge. But we're certainly here to help.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And then I guess an advice for someone that's got a relatively new business and doesn't have a history of documentation to show about a decline in business. I guess, Courtney, that goes to your point of potentially forecasting likely income or looking at current income versus expenses right at this time.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And again, I want to highlight that to be eligible, anyone can really negotiate with their landlord for a lease restructure, but eligibility for this code is based on the eligibility for the JobKeeper as well. So if you're a new business and you're looking to apply for the JobKeeper, there is discretion with the tax commissioner on that based on the information that you can provide them.
And Courtney, can you just clarify, if you have only 1 year or less, say 6 months left on your lease, do I understand it that you have 12 months to pay that deferred amount back as a minimum?
The deferral's over a period of 24 months.
24 months.
So you've got 24 months to pay that deferred rent back.
Great, thank you for clarifying.
So in practical terms, in a case where you've got, say, 6 months left to go on a lease and you came to some arrangement where you were going to not renew that lease, you've come to the determination that that location is not where you want to be going forward and you want to walk away from that place of business. If that's the case, then you would need to be negotiating as part of your departure the paying off of your deferred rental. Having said that, depending on your circumstance, and again, this is very different for every single person probably on the call, and in fact, in part, this was a conversation that I had with a member this morning. if in fact you see that it is a location that you do want to renew, then you clearly are in potentially a better position to say, well, okay, I am prepared to sign on for a year past my 6 months, which would take me into the year of 2021. I'm happy to negotiate a new rental arrangement with you and to build into that the paying off of this deferred rent on the basis that I'm in business and that I've got the capacity to do that. Now, some landlords are likely to say, well, that's bird in the hand is better for me, so they might be in a position to take that on with you. What's been said about this code is that any agreement that is put in place but where COVID-19 gives circumstance where you're unable to fulfill, then we can't wait to see the details of what happens in that circumstance, because it's all very well and good to agree something, but if in the end God forbid, if Simon Birmingham, the Minister for Tourism, is right, and none of us are ever going to be allowed to go on an overseas holiday again until the end of 2021, and I'm not sure what planet that guy's on. But if that's the case, then why would you renew your lease? I mean, if you're taking the advice of the Tourism Minister, you'd say, well, that's it. That's the end of the travel industry. So I can assure you that that's not the case. I'm not quite sure who's briefed him on that, and he needs an uppercut, because I've got multiple emails from members telling me that if that's the case, we may as well just give up. So I'm not quite sure if anyone's seen that, but he was apparently doing radio over the weekend telling everybody that you won't be able to go on a holiday overseas until the end of 2021. It can't be right. I digress. So I would just suggest, when it comes to your rental arrangement, if you're coming up to the end of the lease, the hard decision you've got to make is whether you want to be in that location going forward, or whether you just want to hibernate and walk away, and then you need to negotiate the best outcome for you based on that decision for that location. But in any event, if you are going to walk away from that location at the end of the 6 month, you would be taking with you any rent deferral as a debt going forward. And you've just got to be mindful of that, because once you make those commitments, so contracts are signed, and it's not as though, unfortunately, it isn't a situation where you can just walk away from that. It will be with you going forward. As much as that's not a great thing to say, it is the fact of it.
And Courtney, a question around the rent fee waiver amount. Do you have to pay that portion back?
The rent waiver?
Yeah, the rent waiver.
No, it's a waiver. It's rent free, and it's not required to be paid back. Half of that cash flow relief will be applied as the rent waiver, and half will be as part of the rent deferral, which we were just talking about.
And can that be negotiated on? Does it always have to be 50%?
The rent deferral is up to 50%.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying.
But having said that though, that's what the code says. That's what the code says. So the idea of the code is really to spark the landlord into action. And if you're a smart and clever person and you manage to convince your landlord to give you a waiver greater than that, well, good on you. There's nothing to suggest that you can't negotiate something beyond the code. It's just that the code is the minimum standard, if you like. So certainly if you're in a situation where your landlord wants to be nice to you and wants to give you a greater waiver because they're more willing to understand how much trouble you're in, then, by all means accept a greater amount. There is nothing wrong with that either. It's more that it's a rule to try and ensure that landlords are treating tenants with an expectation and understanding of the code that's been developed.
And do you know the effective date for the rent relief commencement?
Today.
Great.
Now.
Okay, so effective immediately.
And also, sorry, Joe, in all seriousness, it's whatever date you can negotiate. So as I said to these people I spoke to this morning, I've said, well, you should definitely be negotiating a deal from the 1st of April, because you're already 14 days into the calamity. So whatever you're going to have to pay back, you should make sure incorporates from the 1st of April. But, depending on what your situation is, if you haven't paid March, the rent in March, because you just physically haven't got the money, and the landlord's willing in good faith to have a discussion with you and apply the arrangement backdated to the 1st of March, well, good on you. That's okay as well. And if you can't get anywhere with anyone about that and it ends up being from the 1st of May and you're happy to do that too, that's also okay. There isn't really any hard and fast rule there. And I think that obviously some of the bigger landlords are likely to be insistent on awaiting the implementation of the formal nature of this code. And that may, I don't know if you've seen, but that may spell out some specifics around dates. But I would have thought, you know, anything you can negotiate can be for any date you can come up with.
And Courtney, when a travel agent talks to their property manager, what's the official code called that they can refer to?
The official, the mandatory code of conduct, or they've called it the Commercial Tenancies Code is the official name.
Commercial Tenancy.
That's the name that the National Cabinet's given it. So each state and territory will now implement it, but I expect that it'll still be called the Commercial Tenancies Code.
Great, thank you. And if our members want to go to an official announcement or website, what's the best place they can go and read up on the code? Have they published it on any of their government websites yet?
They have. They've put it on the business.gov website, and so we can send that link around with the webinar recording email later on this afternoon, perhaps. There's some really, really good content on there that really breaks down the key principles of the code.
Great. Okay, we can definitely send that link around, everybody. It is a specific question, but I think it's quite an interesting one. Andrew's lease will expire on the 30th of June, but it's already paid up in full. He's about to enter new negotiations for a new lease. However, if they won't renew, can they evict him after the 30th of June? Can we comment on that one? I think it's quite interesting.
Well, I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I would have thought under the moratorium of eviction that would apply. So no, he couldn't be evicted. But I think that in saying no, you couldn't be evicted, I don't think you could also just sit there for 3 months and not do a deal and pay any rent. So I think it's about being fair and reasonable. But I would be of the view that the non-eviction moratorium would stand, except you'll be out of lease. So therefore, on what grounds would you be sitting as of the 1st of July in those premises if you haven't done it by agreement with the landlord? So I don't think they're evicting you. It'd be that you wouldn't have a lease.
Great.
Do you agree with that?
I think you've explained that well, Jason. Yeah.
Yeah.
We haven't seen that question pop up.
No, sorry guys. I mean, we're just consuming this information along the journey with you. So we're doing our best, but we love these sort of examples because they do test us. And any that we definitely don't know, we assure you that we'll take away and try and get a more specific answer. But, you know, as I've said on many of these calls with other stuff, JobKeeper and other things, you know, if you apply the common sense rule first, pretty much usually you're right. And then it's about drilling back down to the various specifics that come through.
And I really like this question from Peter. He's asked, what about outgoings? Are these included in the discount or in the negotiation for rent reduction?
My read is it's rent. So if your outgoings, the way I read it is it's about rent waiver and all the discussion about rent. I haven't seen yet, and Court, I don't know if you've seen in any of the detail yet, any comment about outgoings. Now, obviously everybody's lease is different. Some people's rent is gross, it includes outgoings. Some people's outgoings are proportionate to the rent or proportionate to the square meterage. It really just does depend on the individual lease. But my read so far is that it only relates to the rental payment.
Yeah, that's right, Jason. That's what I've read so far. We're still sort of trying to find the minutiae detail. Although I do understand that landlords should, where appropriate, waive recovery of other expenses and any outgoings that are payable by a tenant during the period that the tenant is not able to trade. But in terms of the rent waiver and the deferral, my understanding is it's rent.
So, for example, if on top of your rent, there's cleaning costs, or there might be a shared electricity arrangement because of some way in which you're in a shared environment, or you've got other strata proportionate outgoings and the like, I think that should all form part of your discussion with the landlord. It is very much a subject to your individual lease scenario. Of course, if your rent is gross, then you're in a good shape, because whatever you negotiate as a reduction for the rent, it includes all the outgoings. So I would just put it on the table at the point of negotiation and see what is said. And once we are able to further unpack that detail, we'll certainly get that out as soon as we can.
And I think this is our last question. What about an organisation that doesn't qualify for JobKeeper because its turnover is larger than those that qualify for JobKeeper? Do you know what they will use as a measure of decline in turnover?
So every business in Australia that has a turnover, regardless of turnover, is eligible for JobKeeper. It's just a question of the calibration for the over $1 billion turnover piece. So my understanding is that the rules very much relate to small business, and I think the thinking is that a large business that's turning over more than $1 billion would be in a position through its own footprint to have the ability to negotiate something with their landlord. But Court, have you got a different lens on that from my reading?
Yeah, no, look, the code's really aimed at SMEs, so small to medium enterprises.
Right.
But like as Jason said, I mean, everything is up for negotiation right now. So even though this code might not be particularly applicable to them, it doesn't stop them from trying to negotiate a lease restructure in some form.
Great, thanks guys. We'll leave it there for now. We will circulate the business.gov.au website where you can find more information. We'll also circulate a link to this webinar recording. And we have a great lineup of webinars this week. So do make sure that you go to the AFTA website to look at what other webinars we have. Online tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Courtney will be delivering a JobKeeper Your Questions Answered webinar. So we've taken some of the most general and commonly asked questions and we'll be providing some more detail around those. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.